Hi, I'm Peter Jones, Chartered Surveyor, author and property investor.
A question I'm sometimes asked is, what is net yield and how does that differ from gross yield? Well, in an earlier video we thought about gross yield, which is basically the rent divided by the purchase price or the value times 100, a very basic assessment of the return that you're going to get from the property. Now, net yield allows us to go into a slightly more sophisticated view of the property, because net yield is the return of the property but taking into account the costs involved. So if you were calculating a true net yield, then you would be taking off the costs of purchase, probably, but also the costs of letting the property out, because the rent which you're going to receive is going to come at a cost. You're probably going to have a letting agent, you're probably going to have letting fees, you're going to have a managing agent who's going to manage the property and collect the rent for you, probably. And you could even take this further, because a true net yield could also reflect the cost of financing the property. So as well as taking those costs off the rent, you may also deduct the costs of mortgage interest, for example. If you wanted to get really, really sophisticated, you even get into the realms of taking tax off, but that's beyond a lot of us. And it all depends on what you're trying to do, because the reason why I would be calculating a net yield as opposed to a gross yield is I'd be looking at the actual return to me personally. A net yield would allow me to take into account the actual cost, for example, of finance to me. It may be that with your particular circumstances, you can go to lender A, who are going to lend you a buy-to-let mortgage, I don't know, at 2.5%. But perhaps because of my circumstances, I have to go to lender B, and they're going to lend to me at 3%, in which case our net yield is going to be slightly different. So you can work out what the net yield would be to you, and I could work out what the net yield would be to me. Similarly, if you're going to manage the property yourself and not have a managing agent, then that's going to increase the return to you. So you'd have a slightly different net return than I would, because I would use a managing agent. Now, again, as I was saying in the video about gross yield, there is no real standard definition. And you'll see people talking about gross and net yields as if everybody understands what they're talking about, but you need to understand what that particular person has taken into account. Particularly, for example, if you're going to go to a deal packager or a deal sourcer who starts bandying around figures saying this is going to net you 6%, find out what that means. What have they taken into account? Because very often you'll find, for example, with the deal packager and the sourcer, that all they've done is deducted the mortgage interest, but they haven't thought about the other costs that are involved, like the managing agent, like any repairs which may come up, like any void periods which may be needed to be taken into account when you don't have a tenant. Why do we use terms like this, gross yield and net yield? Well, basically as an aid to comparison, but you need to know that you're comparing apples with apples and not apples with pears.
Well, I hope you found that informative and inspirational. And if you want help in property, please do come over to my website, www.thepropertyteacher.co.uk. Loads of great resources there, including my blog. There's loads of free videos, loads of great articles. There's free reports to download, including Learning with Peter, where you'll be able to access resources like my video courses, like my ebooks, including my home study course, the Successful Property Investors Strategy Workshop, which I've literally sold thousands of copies of, which takes you through how I started in property, literally with none of my own money, but how I was able to build a portfolio of £2 million worth of property in just 4 years. I'll show you everything that I did right so that you can do the same, and I'll show you everything that I did wrong. I'll tell you about all of my mistakes so that you can avoid them, so that you can progress in property far more quickly than me. Until next time, here's to successful property investing.